Good evening. On behalf of the Indiana University College of Arts and Sciences, I would like to thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Vanessa Clow, and I serve as the college's Director of Alumni Relations. Our Food for Thought live streaming series serves as an opportunity for alumni and friends to hear from faculty experts, explore topics of interest, and stay connected with IU and the College of Arts and Sciences, regardless of your location. Before we begin this evening's program, I would like to acknowledge that tonight's event is being held in collaboration with the college's themester program. Themester is held each fall semester and combines academic courses, public lectures and exhibits, film showings, and other events to engage students and the entire community in a collective learning experience about a timely issue. Tonight's featured topic highlights this year's theme of resilience. To learn more, visit themester.indiana.edu. At this time, I'm delighted to introduce our featured presenter, Dr. Richard Henne-Ochoa, a visiting assistant professor of American Studies and director of the American Indian Studies Research Center or Institute. Dr. Henne-Ochoa is an interdisciplinary scholar whose research and publications include the fields of linguistic, anthropology, sociocultural learning theory, and Native American and Indigenous studies. Following his presentation, Dr. Henne-Ochoa will be joined by Professor Daniel Suslak for the audience Q&A session. Dr. Suslak is a linguistic anthropologist with over 25 years of experience executing ethnographic and linguistic field research in southern Mexico. He is especially interested in Sakian languages and the communities where they are spoken. You can submit your questions at any point during this evening's discussion. Simply click on the Q&A tab located in your webinar toolbar. Hover your mouse over your screen and your toolbar should appear. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Henne-Ochoa for his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa, for introducing me. I want to welcome you all to what I hope will be a fascinating presentation on and discussion about Native American and Indigenous language revitalization. Whether language revitalization is a topic entirely new to you or a topic with which you have expertise, hopefully you will take away something of interest and value, something worth thinking about. As Vanessa said, I'm Richard Henne-Ochoa. I'm a visiting assistant professor in American Studies. I am also an adjunct professor of anthropology, and I am the director of the American Indian Studies Research Institute, or Azrie as we call it, at IU Bloomington. Please allow me to very briefly introduce myself, just my academic background. And if I get to know you better, perhaps I'll share something more personal, just maybe. My doctoral and postdoctoral work includes training in education and anthropology, with a focus on sociocultural learning theory, as well as linguistic anthropology. For my research, I rely primarily on ethnographic and ethnohistorical methods. I specialize in the ethnography of communication. For the past 30 years, I have concentrated my research on understanding Native American and Indigenous ways of communicating, particularly how ways of communicating relate to language endangerment and language revitalization. I have carried out most of my research in collaboration with Lakota people on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. I teach courses at IUB in the Department of American Studies. I have taught a number of courses, including What is America?, which examines social, cultural, economic, and political dimensions of American life and what it means to be American. Also included in my teaching is a course titled Introduction to Native American and Indigenous Studies. And here, let me give a shout out to my wonderful students attending tonight. Hi to all of you. Thank you for attending. I appreciate you. So my research and teaching is within the field of Native American and Indigenous studies, and I am especially interested in understanding the reasons why Native and Indigenous languages are facing an existential threat and how they might continue to be spoken for generations to come. Enough about me. Let's get into the topic at hand. Native and Indigenous language revitalization as a dimension of Native and Indigenous resilience. I do not want to perpetuate alarmist rhetoric relating to language, but some context is necessary to understand the nature of the issue of language endangerment and revitalization. It has been estimated that by the end of the 21st century, about half of the world's 7,000 plus languages will no longer be spoken if trends continue without significant intervention. Regardless the exact scale in which language loss plays out in the future, we know that most of the languages that are declining in use are Native and Indigenous languages. These so-called smaller languages are being replaced by so-called larger or official languages, that is, world majority languages such as English, Mandarin, Hindi, and Spanish. It's hard to fathom the magnitude of the loss of half the world's languages within the span of a few generations. But you can get some idea of the magnitude if you look at this map showing the status of dozens of languages in the United States alone. Native American, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian languages are shown by the colored pins. And the darker the color of the pin, the more endangered the language. In fact, the darkest colored pins indicate languages that are no longer spoken by anyone. Each language represents not simply a tool for communication, but a language community with a particular history, a worldview, a culture, and a set of knowledge systems. Each language is an amazing collective human achievement. And now some have likened threatened and endangered languages to threatened and endangered biological species. As we will explore here later, this comparison is useful to think about insofar as it gets us thinking about not just the loss of linguistic codes themselves or the loss of individual biological species. The biological comparison to the loss of language is useful for calling our attention to the loss of what we might call habitat or environments that nurture and sustain Native and Indigenous language use. From this vantage point, we are focused on the people, places, events, purposes, and forms that give rise to language. We see language as situated social interaction, that is, language as existing not in isolation, but in sociocultural context. We see language not simply as a code as represented by grammars and dictionaries. We see language as a process of people engaged in social life, using language according to the cultural standards for appropriate behavior with others. And I'll have more to say on that later. The reasons for the unprecedented decline in so many languages at roughly the same time are well understood. Two words, colonization and globalization, explain a great deal. Colonization of Native American and Indigenous peoples worldwide led and is leading to the destruction of local cultures and languages. Of course, Indigenous families, communities, and whole sovereign Native and Indigenous nations have resisted colonization and been resilient, but institutional racism, such as practiced through boarding schools and day schools designed to exterminate Indigenous languages and cultures and assimilate Indigenous people into dominant societies, has had enormous consequences. With globalization, local economies are drawn into larger and larger scales of commerce. People are drawn from their own community to new locations in search of employment, and out of necessity, they may leave behind their community and relatives, who may be the only other people who speak the language. At the same time, within local language communities, there are a multitude of pressures coming from the outside. Television, the internet, and radio, for example, bring world majority languages into homes, often drowning out Native American and Indigenous languages. And caregivers of children, wanting as all caregivers want the best opportunities for their children, are often eager for them to learn the language of formal education and the wider economy, sometimes at the expense of their ancestral language. Now, I would like you to explore with me language revitalization in practice. As I said, language revitalization, which goes hand in hand with culture revitalization, is an aspect of Native Indigenous resilience. Let's explore why most Native North American communities are working to revitalize their ancestral languages. Let's also explore the methods Native American families and communities are using to teach ancestral languages. We'll also look at what Indiana University's American Indian Studies Research Institute has done to help revitalize Native American languages. And finally, let's examine what our research at the American Indian Studies Research Institute is telling us about pathways forward for language revitalization. So why are most Native North American communities and many families working to revitalize their ancestral languages? There are a variety of reasons, but one very commonly cited reason is the connection between language and ethnic identity. Simply put, to be connected to one's ancestral language is to have a sense of belonging to your community, to your people, to your tribe, to your nation, to, for example, being Cherokee or Lakota or Yupik. Another commonly cited reason is the inseparable bond between language and culture. People will say, if we lose our language, we will lose our culture. And so there is a strong sense within Native and Indigenous communities that without the language, the people will no longer have a distinct culture. Further, there is a belief among some that without the language, tribal sovereignty may be impossible to maintain. The methods or approaches used by Native American families and communities to teach their languages are quite diverse. These approaches are situated in schools and daycare facilities, individual families and communities. Native American language teaching includes an array of strategies that are used for second language learning. This includes the use of language textbooks with scripted lessons, storytelling, both orally and in writing, role play, flashcards, etc. All the things you can imagine in teaching a second language. But in communities that have enough speakers fluent in the target language, one approach has become favored among all others, and that is total immersion. For example, shown here, preschoolers gather together in what are called language nests, places where they are totally immersed in the language with caregivers who are fluent speakers of the language. The children learn the language as they carry out everyday preschool activities. In K through 12 schools, immersion classrooms are spaces where Native and Indigenous language is the medium of instruction and learning. Also used is what is called the mentor-apprentice model. A fluent speaker is paired with someone who wants to learn the language. The two of them are immersed in the language and they engage in everyday activities together. And of course, new technologies are making it possible for language learners to gain linguistic knowledge and skill through social media, gaming, and virtual and augmented reality. And we can expect to see these technologies become even more ubiquitous for Native and Indigenous language learning in the years ahead. Let's now turn to what Indiana University's American Indian Studies Research Institute, or Azrie, has done to help revitalize Native American languages. Azrie has a long history on the IUB campus. Let me give some historical background about Azrie, and that will provide some context for what is to follow. Azrie was founded in 1985 by the late Raymond Damali, a professor of anthropology, and Ray, along with his partner and the late Douglas Parks, co-directed Azrie for decades. The two dedicated their lives to the study of Native American languages and cultures and to Native American history. Most of that work was carried out in collaboration with Plains tribes, including the Pawnee, Lakota, and Arikara, among others. They documented several Native American languages through audio recordings, which are in some instances the only recordings of fluent speakers of the languages. They also transcribed and translated the recordings. Here is an example of the meticulous work they and many Azrie students and research associates produced. This is a transcript and translation of a story told by Assiniboine speaker Rose Weasel of Fort Belknap Indian Reservation in Montana. Ray Damali and Douglas Parks recorded the story in 1985, and Linda Cumberland, one of their graduate students at the time, translated the story. Note the way the Assiniboine or Nakota language is written. The writing system or orthography was created to represent all of the sounds in the language. The story itself is what is known as an Iktomi tale. Iktomi is a trickster, and Iktomi stories always have a moral lesson in them. And they're quite entertaining, very funny things that Iktomi does. Let's listen to Rose Weasel begin the story.
Iktomi가 기어야한 거 야, 차원하랬다. Tago na horte. Ina si chana kita. Anak optunga. Magale chabit. Quack, quack, quack. Kaya kabe. Oh, ne pa kontab. Chawa knai. Ete yu a sangi iktusen. Tatani joga ni yohanam. Ape ha hink choga kita nes kaksa hink nere. Yu pa hink umpakta hink. Kini chen ni jak na yaunga. Iktom zeta good. Tokina.
So perhaps this is the first time you have ever heard a Native American language being spoken. And if so, it is thanks to Ray and Doug and so many others at Azrie who have dedicated themselves to the documentation of this and other Native American languages. Recordings such as the Iktomi Story by Rose Weasel are extremely valuable for language revitalization efforts. Over the years, Azrie has relied on these recordings to not only document the languages spoken, but also produce language learning materials for various tribal schools. And as one example, here is the cover and one entry from an Assiniboine or Nakota alphabet book. I want to give a shout out to Cynthia Ramlow, Josh Richards, and Travis Myers, who were instrumental in the production of this language learning resources and so many other resources, print and multimedia. This example of a second grade textbook is from the Lakota Language project that Azrie did in partnership with Red Cloud Indian School on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. Melissa Strickland, Bob Braveheart, Kristen Alton, Cecil Apple, Nikki Bell, and several others played crucial roles in developing a K-12 curriculum for the Lakota language. These are but two examples of the kind of work carried out at Azrie to help Native American communities maintain and revitalize their ancestral language. Let's now turn to the research at Azrie that is laying a pathway forward for language revitalization. To begin, I'll share with you a story. During a 2-year period of full-time ethnographic fieldwork on Pine Ridge, Frida Apple, a Lakota elder, revealed a telling truth to me. She expressed why it was that her people's efforts to revitalize the Lakota language had not moved them very far along towards their goal of reestablishing Lakota language use in everyday family and community life, despite almost 2 decades of deep commitment and very hard work. Mrs. Apple first reminded me that her community had for more than a generation a Lakota language learning program in their school from the pre-K level through high school. Yet she noted, other than the handful of children in her community who had already developed Lakota language fluency at home through informal interaction with their Lakota-speaking caregivers and siblings, children and youth rarely spoke Lakota outside their in-school Lakota language lessons. Mrs. Apple went on to remind me that her community's Lakota language revitalization initiatives relied primarily on Lakota as a second language classes in school. Further, she said, their approach at the K-12 levels taught children and youth Lakota language in such a way that most of them came to think of Lakota as a school subject like math and social studies. And they limited their speaking it to the school classroom where they received Lakota language lessons. She was understandably disillusioned and frustrated, as was her husband, Francis, who himself was a Lakota language teacher in the school. Since that time, almost 25 years ago, when Mrs. Apple shared these thoughts, I have learned the situation the Apples and the Lakota community more generally found themselves in is still the norm the world over. That is, despite deep commitment to language revitalization and the establishment of language learning programs, very few peoples have been able to approach their goal of reestablishing common use of their ancestral language in their homes, families, and communities, even when the programs are founded on best practices in language learning, including total immersion in preschool and the grades that follow. Now, to be sure, there have been cases where language revitalization efforts have met with relative success, and it is imperative that we acknowledge and learn from these successes. Within a few Native and Indigenous communities, for example, language revitalization initiatives produce new fluent speakers because, and this is important, they support the use of the endangered language to communicate in a variety of naturalistic situations and domains, which is the main goal of most language revitalization programs. They do so because they are founded upon a conception of language as social interaction, embedded within and inseparable from cultural practices, and not just the cultural practices that occur in school settings. They're also built on a conception of learning as a sociocultural historical process of dynamic growth. And this growth involves transforming learners' participation toward more contributions to and belonging in the language community, which in turn generates continued language use. These insights, which I have gained mostly from Frida Apple, Francis Apple, Reva Highhorse, Brian Charging Cloud, Karen White Butterfly, but also other Lakota people, have motivated me to think about and do research on what Lakota or what language revitalization entails in sociocultural terms. Now, I just unloaded some ideas that need unpacking, so let's do that. Let us start by questioning ideas about what language is. What is language? Common notions of language are that a language is an autonomous, context-independent code or thing. The very existence of grammars and dictionaries reinforce this notion. But what if we replace that view with a view of language as social interaction, a process rather than a thing or even a body of knowledge as represented in grammars and dictionaries? Further, what if we see language as inseparable from the context in which social interaction takes place? By conceiving of language in this way, you can appreciate how language, far from static object, lives through people and within situations and events. And here, I want to thank Richard Bauman, IU Distinguished Professor Emeritus, for helping me to understand language in this way back when I was a postdoctoral research fellow under his mentorship. So hold on to that thought about what language is. What is learning? Learning is commonly understood or simply taken for granted in Western cultures as a process involving the transmission of knowledge and skills from one person to another or people through instruction. This is a cognitive model of learning. Consider a different view of learning. Learning as a process of transforming participation in activity, usually from peripheral involvement to eventually full engagement as one develops fluency. And here, let me thank Barbara Rogoff for this insight. This sociocultural view of learning is a main pillar for seeing language revitalization as a process of becoming a member of a language community, not simply by acquiring knowledge of a language, but by participating in that community according to its cultural standards for appropriate social interaction. In other words, people are socialized through and to use language. Not surprisingly, it's called language socialization. At this point, we need an example to illuminate what all this has to do with language revitalization. Consider an approach to language revitalization that is not centered on preschools and schools, on textbooks and scripted lessons, and even on total immersion in classrooms, which may be the only places where learners use the language. As important as these approaches are for any community revitalizing their language, consider another approach. This approach, which a few Native American and Indigenous communities are following, is centered on reclaiming languages into the ecologies of family and community life. It is not unlike reclaiming habitat for threatened and endangered species, not trying to preserve the species in zoos and botanical gardens. What do I mean? The approach I'm talking about is learning by observing and pitching into family and community endeavors. To illustrate what this approach to language revitalization looks like in practice, let's consider again the case of the Lakota. On Pine Ridge, while the Lakota language is endangered, learning by observing and pitching in is still a common practice in many family and community endeavors, from preparing meals to conducting traditional Lakota ceremonies. For instance, younger members of the local community learn how to carry out inipi, or sweat lodge ritual, which with guidance from their older relatives, and as they all contribute to these endeavors in collaborative fashion. Typically, verbal communication occurring immediately outside of the sweat lodge and involving those who do not speak Lakota fluently is carried out almost entirely in English. Verbal communication between or among older Lakota speakers ordinarily in Lakota. However, in some families, elders and others who are fluent Lakota speakers purposely speak in Lakota around and inside of the sweat lodge when conducting an EP to those who are not fluent to help them acquire Lakota communicative competence. In turn, the latter reply in Lakota to the extent of their competence, such that they are not only able to better align their contributions with accomplishing the collective endeavor, but also so they develop their ability to comprehend and produce Lakota speech. So a learning by observing and pitching in based approach to language revitalization would promote communication situated in community life. The younger generations would be motivated by a desire to belong to the community and contribute to the successful execution of collaborative endeavors. Older generations, that is, the already fluent speakers, would be motivated by a desire to accomplish the endeavors, as well as perpetuate the language intergenerationally. The collaborative activity, be in a traditional ceremony, subsistence activity, game, preparing meals, etc., would unfold as an organic, fluid process, like an ensemble of musicians, each member in tune with the others. Those who participate would acquire the ancestral language through wide, keen attention and contributions to events, especially the communication necessary to execute them. Further, their learning of the language would depend in part on feedback they receive from other participants, especially those who are fluent in the language. All told, the learning by observing and pitching in approach to language revitalization would socialize novices to habitual patterns of communication and contribute to the revitalization of the culture by reintegrating the two. And it is this reintegration of language and cultural practices that must happen for languages to thrive. Now, you may be wondering at this point what a community is to do if there are no longer any fluent speakers. Briefly, I can tell you that one way to address this matter is to take an intermediate step or steps and create video modules that replicate social interaction as endeavors are carried out. And this can be done using whatever records of the language exist, along with video recordings of people doing everyday activities. The documentation of the language will allow those developing the modules to recreate what people say to each other as they, for example, cook dinner. Video recordings of such activities could be made in which the participants have learned some of the language that is used when doing those activities. And these modules could be the basis for learning the language needed for participating in activities in everyday life. Of course, there is much more to all of this, including community development, wellness and healing, and so on. So that gives you some insight into pathways forward for language revitalization and into the research and outreach that Azrie will do moving forward. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. And hopefully what I shared this evening is enough to give you some insight into Native American and Indigenous language revitalization. Now, I'll turn it over to my friend and colleague, Daniel Suslak, who will moderate our discussion. Thank you.
Hi, good evening. Can you hear me okay, Rich and everybody?
Yes.
Awesome. So hello, my name is Dan Suslak, and I'm coming to you from Ballantyne Hall, where I just finished teaching a graduate seminar. I'm a big fan of Dr. Henne-Ochoa and his research, and I'm excited to have this conversation. I don't think there are any questions in the Q&A just yet, so I'll take advantage of the lull to ask a few of my own questions, or maybe to read the minds of some of the potential audience members for this talk. So could you maybe say a few words? Is there Is there a place for interested, well-meaning outsiders, whether they're experts like yourself, or whether they're audience members who just have an abiding interest in native cultures? Is there a place for outsiders to participate in revitalization efforts? And what would that look like, or where would they start?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's really a good question, because it gets at some of the politics around language revitalization. And I think there is a role for non-native, non-indigenous people to play. I think, like, for example, some of the things that I'm doing, it's kind of on the periphery about language revitalization theory. It's not necessarily always in the trenches. I do know as well that in some communities or some individuals, they are strongly opposed to outsiders helping, particularly if those outsiders are, say, creating materials that they are selling back to the communities. And that can create a real problem where communities feel like they may have copyright to their language, or at least the right to whatever materials may be produced using their language. So you bring up an important question, and I suppose the crux of the matter is whether the community itself wants outsiders working on the language and working with them, and if so, in what capacities.
I can imagine some follow-ups, but we have a question from the chat now, so I'll put this one out, and let me just apologize to everybody in advance if I mispronounce your names or bungle what you're trying to ask. But Roberta Clipper is asking about the example of Welsh revitalization and whether that provides a potential model for revitalizing Indigenous North American languages. And let me also, I'll just say, if you're fascinated by the case of Welsh, another really interesting example is Manx, which is a close relative of Welsh spoken on the Isle of Man, which has gone from virtual extinction to a pretty successful, thriving revitalization effort. So, but I'll hand the question over to Rich. What do you think of sort of looking to examples from other parts of the world for ideas about how to pursue the work in the US?
Yeah, I think we have to look at examples throughout the world. We have to look at the successes for Welsh, or thinking about Gaelic, for example, and efforts to do something along the lines of what I'm talking about, is reclaiming languages in everyday family and community spaces, so that they're not treated as school languages or just for school, but they're part of the conduct and creation of social life. And so I think we should look all over the world. I mean, many people point out the Maori and Hawaiians as examples of relative success stories. And again, to kind of restate what I was talking about earlier, in these places, what seems to be working for them is to create new fluent speakers, is to situate the language in everyday activities, and not to treat the language learning as strictly a school matter or a preschool matter, or just in the immersion, the language nest, but that there are opportunities created, there's scaffolding built for people to use the language outside of those formal settings, and get it into informal settings. And as we know, there's a great need to regenerate intergenerational transmission of languages that occurs from caregiver to children. So what's going on in the language nest also needs to be going on in the homes. And so coming back to the question, we need to look all over and see where are these successes. And of course, we need to pay attention to the particulars of each case. Their communities are not all the same, of course, and their language histories are not all the same. And so there may be something that works in one community, but it doesn't work in another. And so it's very important that for any given case, that there be some deliberate language planning and not just a wholesale adoption of what some other community might be doing.
I think there was a sort of a follow-up question about Irish too, another really interesting example. We have a colleague named Emily McEwen-Fujita who does this really interesting research on revitalization of Scots Gaelic. And one of the examples she gives is this government building. They decided to make the elevators and the cash machines speak to people in Gaelic rather than in English. And at first, everybody was horrified. Cash machines speak English; they don't speak Gaelic. But it's the kind of thing that once people see what's possible, then the gears start to turn, and in short order, people get used to the idea and excited about it. So there are a whole flood of questions coming in now. So let me try to pull a few of them together. What, in your view, how much of an issue is the difficulty of a language? Maybe it's difficulty in pronunciation or really complex grammar. What sort of a factor is that in efforts to keep a language going or revitalize it?
Yeah, I
Is that
think
even the right way to think about it?
Yeah, well, let me, that's a great question, and let me frame it in a slightly different way. Let's think about it in terms of like second language learning in a classroom, and language kind of lifted out of its, if you will, sort of natural setting and put into a formal educational setting. And yes, some languages are more difficult to learn than others. And so we could say that within a classroom setting and using Euro-Western ways of teaching language, like through a textbook, through drill and practice, and so on, that it may be much harder to learn a language than another language, one language over another language. But we also can reframe it in terms of how languages are learned in family and community life. And regardless of the difficulty of the language, people learn a language. Kids develop fluency in the language, regardless of how difficult it is. It's not that the language is so difficult that in some communities that the kids don't start speaking till they're 10. And so it's all of that is to say that we would do well, I think, to think about language revitalization as about revitalization of those kinds of habitats and those family and community endeavors.
So I'm just going to bounce around in some of these questions, and I'll apologize if I do them out of order. I'll try to get to everybody. So, but on this last question of habitats, clearly in our sort of current moment and sort of thinking ahead to the future, some of those habitats are virtual spaces or digital spaces. So could you maybe comment a little bit about sort of native media, native digital spaces, efforts to create spaces for Lakota and other language use online?
Yeah, so I know a little bit about this, and I realize that there are a number of people who they're texting in their language in Lakota or what have you. There are chat room. There are people who are getting together across vast distances on Zoom to talk in the language. But once again, as helpful and as useful as these kinds of technologies are for keeping people communicating in the language, we also have to think about the way language is used to get things done and accomplishing certain tasks. So yes, it's possible to just sit and have a conversation, but conversation is not just what people do, of course. They use language to do all kinds of things. And so while the technologies are especially helpful for promoting things like conversation, when it comes to actually using culturally appropriate language to accomplish a certain task, we may be missing something.
So here's an interesting question that I want to highlight. If you've ever spent any time looking at one of these maps of languages across North America, where each block represents Lakota or Kiowa or Miami or Cherokee, right? It leaves you with the impression that there are these sort of isolated groups of monolingual speakers of this language or that language. But in fact, we have all kinds of great ethnohistorical evidence that parts of North America were very urbanized, multi-ethnic. People probably spoke several different languages. And even setting that aside, we know that when the US government forcibly moved different communities onto reservations, that speakers of different languages were sort of jumbled all together in single communities. So what about this idea that a native language community could also be a multilingual community, and that revitalization might not just be about focusing on a single language, but focusing on sort of the totality of the sort of communicative repertoire of people?
Yeah, that's fascinating subject. So yes, it's true that when you look at language revitalization programs, they tend towards revitalizing a single language within a certain community or school, and it's the rare exception, and where multiple, let's say multiple native or indigenous languages are being taught. I think you're quite right to point out that this idea of monolingual community is sort of a fiction. We know obviously that there's this kind of multilingual environments and always have been. And so it kind of blurs the lines between someone being a speaker of one language or another, but then we start seeing languages that may be blended and so forth. And giving rise to pigeons and so forth. But I think that as language revitalization moves forward, people are going to want to acquire more than one language. They're going to want to, for instance, if there's a couple and they have a household together, and one of them is a Lakota speaker and one of them's a Cheyenne speaker, why not be speaking Lakota, Cheyenne, and of course English all in the same household? It only makes sense, but it does, bringing up this kind of multilingualism can complicate revitalization efforts that are, say, situated in formal institutions where they may be equipped or given only enough time to work on one language.
So there are several questions revolving around this question that I started with about how people can get involved, should they get involved, and I sort of see this in two parts based on what I'm reading on the screen. So part of this is just how just any interested party can get started, or some potential resources or places to sort of look for opportunities to do something, to get involved. But then there's the other question of Indiana University as a resource, and so maybe I'll start with the second one first. So maybe could you say a few words about Azrie in particular, and IU in general, and the sort of capacity building work that we're doing? So clearly there's a lot of work being done that's really sort of changing the conversation in the domain of technology, sort of creating technology for sharing language resources, for putting communities in touch with each other, for developing dictionaries and media. But then there's also the kind of capacity building that has to do with identifying talented, interested young community members and training them to become their own language experts, education experts, linguists.
Yeah, I think you've hit on something that Azrie is working on very actively right now, and that is working on a model where we're for a long time, Azrie has had truly collaborative partnerships with a number of different Native individuals and tribes. And so that kind of collaboration will continue. But what Azrie is moving towards is more along the model, what you're talking about, is how can IU resources, Azrie resources, and there are vast collections at IU of native languages, musical recordings and so forth that are of value to these communities. And how to leverage those resources to or allow, invite tribal members to leverage these resources to work on the kinds of issues they want to see resolved. What might IU contribute towards rebuilding those communities? Not just being a repository for some recordings that, let's say, tribal members want access to or copies of the recordings, but actually leveraging more resources. It's about curriculum development. It's about the research on language revitalization that can and should be done by Native people themselves. And so that's the exciting part about what IU is doing right now, I think, in the name of Native and Indigenous studies, is walking the walk, walking the talk in terms of leveraging resources that are on IU's campus to rebuild these communities in the ways that Native people themselves see fit.
Do you have any sort of thoughts or comments about Native students currently at IU and sort of what kind of support Azrie or the FNECC or other IU offices are giving those students, and what sort of opportunities might exist for people to sort of engage and learn more?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would invite anybody to come to Azrie to see what we're doing, and particularly you mentioned Native students who are maybe on campus and have an interest in their culture, interested in their ancestral language, to also make contact, because what Azrie is a place, and is becoming more so of a place, where Native people are carrying out work on their own languages. They're carrying out work that that is of interest to them, as opposed to a kind of model where there are a lot of non-Native people going out to Native communities and let's say doing a lot of recording, but then it doesn't necessarily have the involvement of Native people other than being, say, informants. So to that, I would say all are welcome, and to explore with the folks at Azrie kinds of partnerships that could be productive in many ways.
If I could just make a quick plug, one of our, another amazing colleague, her name is Dr. Ilaria Cruz. She teaches at the University of Louisville and has some collaborations that she's doing with linguists here on the IU campus. Ilaria has been doing these children's projects. So her language is called Chatino. It's a Native Mexican language. And she's been working with students to sort of develop sort of children's books in coordination with community members. But one of the really cool things that has happened in this process is that it sort of draws on all kinds of talents. So children's books require storytellers, but also artists. So identifying students who have artistic talents to contribute to the project, also students with sort of technological expertise. So it's been a really interesting experiment in sort of bringing together a lot of different kinds of students with different disciplinary backgrounds and expertise to create something that's very sort of simple and easy, but sort of enormously useful. If you think about these language nest programs that Rich mentioned, right? People need something like stuff to read, to do, to talk about. And so there's no, people need materials. There's no sort of shortage of demand. Let me sort of put together two seemingly unrelated questions and bundle them and give them to you together and see what you'd like to take first. But several people have asked about the limitations of using Latin script, like the sort of English language spelling or even Spanish language spelling, to represent native languages, and whether that creates more problems than it solves or adds an extra layer of difficulty A famous alternative is this Cherokee syllabary that was developed specifically for the Cherokee language. So there are other possible ways of doing this. And then somebody else was asking about plain sign language, and maybe, I know Azrie has been involved in some efforts to sort of study and document plain sign language, but if you look at sort of communication beyond just, you know, the written word, right, it also involves sometimes really complex systems of gesture communication, right, or sort of whole languages that are not spoken. So audience members are interested in hearing what sort of efforts are being done to revitalize those languages.
So let me take the first question first, the one about what it sounds like they're talking about a writing system or orthography. And there are in some places that where there was a writing system developed, maybe they were developed by missionaries, let's say for Lakota language, missionaries who began using Roman alphabet to write Lakota. That more recently, some Lakota people have questioned that and sought to develop their own orthographies. And in some of those orthographies, they are more like a Cherokee syllabary and not so much based on something that missionaries created. That is a process of indigenization and decolonization that's going on around literacy. And so the other question, remind me, the other question is about?
Well, about plain sign language, about sort of indigenous forms of communication that are not oral or written.
Yeah, so you're quite right. Azrie has been involved in the past with documenting plain sign language, and an expert on that is Brenda Farnell at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and she had done some work at Azrie and is currently affiliated with Azrie. And so I do know that in some communities there is an interest in bringing that back, and so along with the oral language. It's not as if that's ignored. It's not as if it's gone. It's not as if nobody's interested. People are interested. People are bringing it back. And it just adds to what you talked about earlier, is kind of a repertoire of communicative practice, and people being able to use kind of multimodal communication.
Certainly that, like the sort of access to cheap video recording technology, i.e. cell phones, has made this kind of work so much easier and more pleasurable. I think we have time for just one more question, alas, but I know that people can reach you at Azrie after the event is concluded and continue the conversation if they're interested in volunteering, taking classes, or learning more. The language nest example is a really interesting case where it was sort of first developed in Hawaii and New Zealand, and was so successful that sort of the model spread to other communities around the world. Is there any particular example that you can point to of some sort of, I don't know, process or project or effort or initiative that you've been involved with in the Lakota community, speaking community, that's a really great model or example that other people could look to? Or like, what's the sort of most interesting and successful thing that you all have done that's worth sharing?
So not to say I have an example that is as promising or as efficacious as a language nest, but I will say among Lakota at Standing Rock and Pine Ridge, there are some community development corporations. I'm thinking of on Pine Ridge, Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation, where language revitalization is not isolated from community development. And so it's just one aspect of rebuilding the nation. It's one aspect among many. So not only is there language revitalization going on, and immersion and language nest going on, and the development of a new educational system, one that is based on Lakota values and perspectives, and practices, but there's also a project for food sovereignty and housing, and rebuilding the economy. And so all of this is, all of these elements are combined in a community development corporation so that they mutually reinforce one another. And so I think that is a fine model for communities wanting to revitalize, is not to just isolate the program in a school setting, but to think of language revitalization and cultural revitalization as part of a broader effort to heal and revitalize community. So that's kind of what I think stands out to me as a model kind of program.
Let me just quickly, so this is not a question, but somebody was pointing out in the chat, and I don't think that viewers can see the Q&A, but somebody was pointing out that the First Nations Student Center at IU sells t-shirts that say Indiana University in 4 different Indigenous North American languages, and 100% of the proceeds go to support, I think, sort of educational programming. So I can't share the link, I think, on the screen, but if anybody's interested, Google for the FNECC at Indiana University, and you should be able to find that, that resource. So with that, I think I have to turn things over to Vanessa Clow, our host for the evening. And I just want to, again, thank you, Rich, for the wonderful presentation, and I could talk about these things for hours, so it's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Dan, appreciate it.
Thank you again for joining us and participating in this evening's live stream. I would like to thank Professors Henne-Ochoa and Suslak for their time and expertise. We are grateful to you all. I would like to thank the Alumni Association and its members for assisting tonight's program as well. Finally, I should acknowledge that events like this would not be possible without the support of donors who understand the value of a liberal arts education. If you would like to support the faculty, students, and programs of the College of Arts and Sciences, consider making a contribution to the Arts and Sciences Priority Fund at the Indiana University Foundation. Until next time, please take care and stay safe.